Today's podcast will feature 4 stories about adventures that go wrong. The audio from all 4 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bungee, and it's about a couple who decides to go bungee jumping, but it does not go as planned. The second story you'll hear is called Geocaching, and it's about for young people who explore this underground tunnel during a scavenger hunt. The third story you'll hear is called 127 Hours, and it's about a man on a solo hike who is forced to make a gruesome decision. And the fourth and final story you'll hear is called Head Count, and it's about this group of boys who go for a hike, and at first everything is going great, until they realize their head count is off. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to give the follow button some acupuncture, but after you put all the needles in their back, just leave. Okay, let's get into our first story called Bungee. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga, in northern Colombia, lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous, old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so, this rope has been very carefully measured, so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping. But every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just scared. But, for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious, and so right away, he called the Amaga Bungee Jumping Company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So, on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who are already in line on this bridge, waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so, Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia in her mind believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now, they've been forced to wait for a really long time, and this whole time they're watching other people jump, and Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do, and so she was beginning to second-guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, "Oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself." But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so, several hours went by at this totally high stress anxious waiting period, and then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line. At which point the staff members, who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so, Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine. And the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then, at some point, one of the staff members finally says, "Okay, jump A." And so Yesenia jumps. Except, it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, "Okay, jump," was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so, when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so, as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend dripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so, literally, the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. Our next story is called Jiakang. On May 2nd, 2000, at approximately midnight Eastern Standard Time, the US government discontinued its use of selective availability. Selective availability was the intentional degradation of public GPS signals. It guaranteed that civilian GPS users would not be able to pinpoint locations on a map using their GPS. They could get to within maybe 50 to 100 meters, but that was the best they could do. Prior to the year 2000, there was some concern that if you gave the general public the ability to use GPS to precisely locate things on a map, that presented an elevated national security risk. But that line of thinking became antiquated. And so, on May 2nd, just after midnight, the so-called Great Blue Switch, as GPS enthusiasts refer to it, was flipped, and instantly tens of thousands of GPS receivers received this incredible upgrade. People who were following this development were eager to test out this new capability. And one such GPS enthusiast, a guy named Dave Omer who lived in Oregon, decided he wanted to create a sort of GPS treasure hunt. So he got this box, and inside of it, he put a notebook and a pen, and he brought it out to the middle of the woods in Oregon. And he got the precise GPS coordinates of where he put it, and he took those coordinates and he went to an online forum and he posted the coordinates. And he said, "Go to these coordinates, and when you get there, if you find what you're looking for, there will be a notebook. Record yourself in the notebook and they'll be out there to check who's done this. And if your name's in there, I'll give you credit on this form." And so, this treasure hunt went viral, and lots of people all over the world thought it was a really cool idea to use this new GPS technology to create treasure hunts all over the world. So people started hiding not just treasure chests with notebooks, but all sorts of random things all over the world, and then posting their coordinates online for people to find. This activity was given a name, Jiakang, and it's alive and well today, and it's streamlined on the official Jiakang app. But as Jiakang has evolved over the years, so too has the level of difficulty at finding some of these caches. Sometimes it requires geocachers to climb mountains, other times it requires them to dive underwater water. And in one case, geocachers in the Czech Republic had to climb into this strictly off-limits, 5-kilometer-long underground tunnel, where the only two entry points were on the two extreme ends. And to get to the geocache, you had to go to the middle of the tunnel. And of course, periodically, this tunnel completely floods. On June 9th, 2018, for geocachers in the Czech Republic decided, you know what? We're going to go down into that tunnel and we're going to get that geocache. So, they made their way over to the Modo El Skybrick tunnel, which was one of the two entry points, and they climb down inside. The reason this tunnel periodically floods is because rainwater gets dumped in there. And the second entry point is literally sitting in a lake. There is literally water sitting right up against the lip of this entry point. So even light rain will get the lake to rise just enough to where all the lake water pours into this tunnel. And so, the day these Vergiacakers are going into this tunnel, the weather forecast called for torrential downpours and flash flooding. And either these Vergiacakers were not paying attention to the weather, or they somehow thought this wouldn't affect their ability to get this Giachechi. So these Giacakers get down into the tunnel and they start making their way towards the center to collect their prize, when outside it starts pouring rain. It rained so much, so fast that the lake entrance started dumping tens of thousands of gallons of water in on the other side. Where this other entrance was at the bottom of a hill, you had all this water rushing in. So it was like two huge waves of water crashing in on them. And in fact, the survivors would say, because they were right towards the middle of the tunnel, they heard what sounded like a car was getting closer and closer and closer and closer, and that's when they realized it was two waves of water crashing in on them. In a panic, they turned and started running back towards the entrance they came in on, but as they're running, they're hit with this wave. And two of the Giacakers got sucked underneath, and the other two were pushed up and were basically bodies surfing their way towards the lake entrance. And so, as they're moving forward, the wave from the lake comes and unhits them, and now the water is dangerously close to the ceiling. And the two that have been pushed towards the lake entrance, they don't know what's happened to the other two, but they're just swimming as fast as they can towards the lake entrance. And they swam almost 2 kilometers in this tunnel as the water get higher and higher and higher and higher, and they're barely able to breathe. By the end, they only had about a couple inches of clearance. By the time they got to the lake, they finally pop out and they get in the lake. And then luckily there was someone that saw them and brought their boat over and picked them up. As for their two friends, unfortunately, they didn't get out of there in time, and they both drowned. Our next story is called 127 Hours. While he was in college at Carnegie Mellon University, Aaron Ralston studied mechanical engineering, French, and piano. And then upon graduation, he moved to the Southwest and took a job as an engineer. But 5 years into his corporate job, he realized he hated it. And so, he quit and moved to Colorado to pursue his real passion in life, which was mountain climbing. On April 25, 2003, Ralston takes a trip to Utah where he plans to explore the Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9 a.m., he gets up and it's this beautiful Saturday morning. He hops on his bike and he bikes 15 miles to Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile gorge that, at certain places, was as narrow as 3 feet across. And so Aaron unlocks up his bike and he begins walking through this canyon. About 6 hours later at 2:45 p.m., Aaron is right at the section of the gorge that's getting really, really narrow, and below him is about 100 feet down to the bottom of the desert floor. He was going to walk with both feet on either wall cause it was so narrow, and kind of Spider-Man his way through the section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder became dislodged above him, and it comes tumbling down, and he barely gets out of the way. But it lands on his arm and it pins his arm against the wall. And he can't move, and he's suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he's 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tries to pull his hand free and push the rock off, but it's not going anywhere. And that's when it dawns on him that he didn't tell anybody he was going to be in this gorge today. No one knows he's here, and he's so far away from anyone that can help him. And he doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have a radio. He's got no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. No, the position he was in was not him dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to position himself against the rocks where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit fairly comfortably, besides his arm being crushed. And he was able to use the rock that actually had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. And after he calms down a little bit after a few minutes, he reaches back and he pulls his bag out in front and he starts taking inventory of what he has. And all he had was 12 ounces of water, so just a single water bottle, and he had to burritos and some candy bark crumbs. That was all he had in terms of tools. All he had was this crummy multi-tool, and it did have a little knife that extended off the end. And almost immediately, he takes that multi-tool and begins chopping away at this boulder to try to see if he can maybe crack it and push half of it off. But he's finding out very quickly that it's completely futile. It is not moving. It is an enormous boulder. It's not going anywhere. He cannot possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set, Aaron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off, but again, all he has is this multi-tool and this crappy little dull knife. And he's thinking, there's no way I can cut through my arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone. And so, very disheartened, he puts his multi-tool away and he begins to nurse the water and slowly eat the food and thinks, maybe some miracle will happen where over the next couple of days someone will be within earshot, I can yell to them and they can come get me, or maybe someone will see me when they're hiking overhead. He can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water. He was becoming delirious. He was actually drinking his own urine at this point, and he expected to die overnight. And so, with his multi-tool, he etched his name into the rock, and then underneath it, he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. And then after that, he put his multi-tool down, and he did have a camera with limited battery, and he pulled that up and, selfie style, he filmed goodbyes to his family. My name is Aaron Ralston. My parents are Donald and Mary Ralston of Auburn, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it. After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and fully expected to die. But he starts to have this really intense dream where he sees himself playing with a child, and he's missing his right arm. And he takes that as a sign that he's supposed to chop his arm off and get out of here alive and go start a family. And so he wakes up from this dream and suddenly all he wants to do is survive. And he looks at his arm, which is already starting to decompose at this point, and he thinks to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm clean through? I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so he began testing, using the edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm using the torque of pushing it over the edge of the edge of the edge of the edge of the edge. Rock. And when he started to sense it was possible, he took a deep breath and then he broke his arm. Takes his multi-tool and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm. Once his arm was free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he saw his arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And high on adrenaline, he climbed these 65 feet out of this canyon with his one arm. He gets to the trail and he runs 6 miles, and he happens to run into a group of hikers. They give him food and water, and they're totally alarmed by him, but they're happy to help him. They call 911, and medics arrived and they saved Aaron's life. Following Aaron Ralston's rescue, they went back to retrieve his arm. But in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, and a winch, and all this heavy equipment, and they were barely able to move it. And they told Aaron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment without killing you. So basically, you had to cut your arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And so for Aaron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to feel like you cut your arm off and that was the right decision. They would take his arm and they would cremate it and give the ashes to Aaron. And Aaron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aaron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped, and he scattered his ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aaron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where James Franco plays Aaron Ralston in the movie. And it's an incredible movie, albeit it's pretty hard to watch. Aaron Ralston himself said the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary because James Franco does an incredible job portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath this boulder for 5 days. The fourth and final story of today's episode is called Head Count. At around 2:00 p.m. on September 24th, 2017, A 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on of this hiking trail. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, and they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so, that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see, just barely, the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so, because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, it was really hot out. Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so, he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple in this pool. And he was yelling to his friends as he did, like, "Hey, I'm gonna go swimming." And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it. And he got to the steps and he immediately took off his shirt, and he pulled his phone out of his pocket and he put it on the steps. And then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down and jumping in. And so, pretty soon this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple. And many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they had all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water, reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water, and Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas like, "Hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing?" And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the, 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now like, "Yeah, get in here, man." And Vishwas, he's like, "Okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, "Hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, right? Memorialize this amazing trip." And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group and, he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who were totally not paying attention to him. And he's saying, "Hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo. Gather up. I'll take a photo of all of us." And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also the picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took selfie style in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it, and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took, Cho. You know, he got all his buddies in frame, everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left. And many of them included his friends, and they were walking around talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends. And he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor, who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. And he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too, and right away, he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple, I still can't figure it out, the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police. And so the police came out to the temple not long after that, and the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool. Stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then, as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool, but they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment, when Sanjay heard that splashing, that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend Vishwas was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool was because Vishwas did not know how to swim. But he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it, and so maybe was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted. Like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on dude, get in here, come swimming with us, us," because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, "Hey, let's take that photo," he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow, except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo. just nobody knew it. And so obviously, an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then, after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor. They called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased. On the morning of July 11th, 2009, an elderly woman grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down at her kitchen table in Pensacola, Florida, to read the local paper. The news was a big part of her day. She had lived in her neighborhood for 60 years, and she liked keeping tabs on everything going on in her community, which was actually usually a lot. Pensacola and the surrounding county had some of the highest crime rates in Florida, and so crimes were always making the news. And so she was not surprised when she opened the paper that morning and saw a police bulletin about a homicide in the area. The bulletin was asking residents of Pensacola to be on the lookout for a specific red van. And when this woman saw the grainy photo of the vehicle, she gasped and almost knocked over her coffee, because she'd seen that van and she knew exactly who it belonged to. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, on the next hot day, offer the follow button a strawberry popsicle, but don't tell them it's actually just frozen hot sauce. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after 5 p.m. on July 9th, 2009, 67-year-old Bud Billings poured some cereal into a bowl and then passed it to his 11-year-old daughter. Then he grabbed another empty bowl, filled that one with cereal too, and passed it to his 10-year-old son. This was Bud's favorite part of the day. It was like a cereal assembly line that he did with his kids every morning while blaring country music from a nearby stereo. It was really the only way to get breakfast on the table, because Bud had a huge family. He and his 43-year-old wife, Melanie, had 9 children, all under the age of 11 years old, who lived in the house with them, and all of them had special needs. Now, it hadn't always been that way, though. Bud and Melanie had gotten married 16 years earlier, and at the time they'd had Bud's adopted son Justin and Melanie's 2 girls, Ashley and Nikki, and at that time, it was actually just Nikki who had special needs, and she required a lot of extra care. She had autism, cerebral palsy, and epilepsy. And unfortunately, just last year, she had died from a stroke, which had been completely devastating for the whole family. But you know, looking after her and caring for Nikki had really made Bud and Melanie want to take care of other kids with special needs too, which was why about 10 years ago they had actually, intentionally, begun adopting children like Nikki. And once they started doing that, they felt so fulfilled and so happy about it that it had been really hard to stop. Bud looked over to where the rest of his kids were gathered around the table eating cereal, and it seemed like a lot, and sometimes it felt like a lot, but Bud loved his big, chaotic family and was really proud he was able to give these kids a home. And he made a good living as an entrepreneur and business owner, to the point where he'd actually been able to build this entire huge house for his kids. It had 9 bedrooms, so everybody could spread out and have their own space. And outside, they had a big fenced-in area with a whole setup, a slide, a swing, big trampoline. Now, the home was technically on the highway, but the driveway was so long they couldn't even hear the cars. Plus, the town of Beulah, Florida, where they lived, was really remote anyway, and there weren't a lot of people around to even be driving on the highway. All that's to say, this big old house on the highway felt more like their own personal little fortress. Especially when you consider the fact that Bud had an extensive surveillance system. He had a bunch of cameras inside and around the property to keep an eye on all the kids and make sure everybody was accounted for. And so Bud filled up the last cereal bowl and went over to the table where his wife, Melanie, was busy breaking up a fight between their 2 youngest. Bud watched her very calmly end the argument without ever raising her voice, which was sort of typical of Mel. She was the most patient person he had ever met. As Bud sat down at the table, the phone rang and Melanie got up to get it. Bud could hear the happiness in his wife's voice as she answered, so he guessed it had to be Ashley, Melanie's oldest daughter. Ashley was 26 now, but she still called home at least a few times a day, which, Bud didn't mind. But it did sort of make him a bit jealous. He wished he was as close with his older son, Justin, as his wife was with Ashley. He'd adopted Justin when he was just a baby, and he was 20 now, and so he basically had him his whole life. But for some reason, Justin, ever since dropping out of college last winter, really didn't seem interested in spending any time with his dad. Bud guessed it was just because he was embarrassed, or maybe there were some growing pains that came with adulthood. But it was still tough to feel the distance with his son. Just then, Melanie suddenly handed Bud the phone and told him that Ashley had a question for him. And Bud could guess what this was about. He owned an auto business and financing center, and Ashley had taken it over a few years ago so that Bud could slow down and spend more time with the kids. But he still helped her with problems as they came up. So Bud took the phone and asked what was up, and sure enough, it was an issue about the business. So Bud listened carefully as she described some billing issue that he did have an easy fix for, and then after they were done, they hung up and they both went about their day. Later that day around 4:00 p.m., Bud went upstairs to his home office. The summer heat had finally broken, so he had spent most of the day outside with his kids. But their 37-year-old neighbor, April Spencer, was now downstairs helping Melanie out with all the kids, which meant Bud could finally break away and go get some work done. Even though Bud was basically retired, he'd been an entrepreneur all his life, and it felt sort of unnatural to completely stop working. So he sort of started a side hustle financing used car lots. He also invested in other businesses, but he was picky about who he got involved with. Recently, he was approached about investing in a local karate company, but he had to back out because he wasn't really sure it could be profitable. Plus, the owner, Patrick Gonzalez, was friends with a man whose name was Cab Dicey, and Bud hated Cab Dicey. Now Bud was a nice guy with a very clear, soft spot for kids, but when it came to business, he never let people get the best of him, and Cab Dicey had tried. Bud and Cab used to be partners, but then Cab had stolen a bunch of money from Bud. And the way Bud had handled it was to basically confront Cab almost every day, calling him all the time and demanding he pay him back. And so on this particular afternoon, Bud decided he would call Cab again and demand his money again. So he dialed Cab's number and he let it ring until it went to voicemail, which was not a surprise because Cab really never answered. Bud decided not to leave a message. Instead, he just hung up and made a few more calls to some associates at his car lots. It was around 5:00 p.m. when Bud went back downstairs to find his wife Melanie and his neighbor April in the kitchen, making some mac and cheese for the kids' dinner. April actually lived on their property in a trailer and was basically part of their family. Melanie and Bud had known her for 10 years at this point. She was also a registered nurse, so she was a huge help with their kids, who all basically had health issues. When Bud got down there, he thanked April and told her she could head back home. Now he was ready to step back in. So they all said their goodbyes, and then the next 2 hours were just a blur of bath time and bedtime. Then it was lights out for the kids right at 7:00 p.m. Once the kids were in bed, Melanie went to clean up the kitchen, while Bud settled down in the living room and turned on the TV. And as he sank into the couch, he let himself feel the exhaustion of the day. He loved his life, and he was ready to do this all over again tomorrow, but still, he was tired. As Bud sat there on the couch, he began to doze off. However, his eyes shot right back open again when he heard a loud bang come from the front door. Instinctively, he leapt up, having no idea what was happening, but all he could hear were these loud pounding footsteps charging through the house, headed straight towards him. 20 minutes later, around 7:30 p.m., Bud and Melanie's neighbor, April Spencer, made dinner in her trailer and got ready to relax for the night. And she had just taken a plate out of her microwave when she heard a child's voice outside yelling, April was more confused than alarmed. I mean, it was typical to hear the kids next door, but usually at this point they were all in bed asleep. And then, before she could investigate, someone started banging on her trailer door and screaming for help. April rushed over and swung it open to see the Billings' 11-year-old daughter standing on her trailer steps, sobbing. She then mumbled through panicked tears that something bad had happened in her house. Seconds later, April sprinted towards the Billings home, which was only a short distance from her trailer. And when she got there, the front door was already open. She hurried inside to find the house very still and quiet, except for the sound of someone sobbing upstairs. She could tell it was one of the kids, and immediately she called up to them that everything was okay. She was here. But then April saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. On the floor of the hallway, just outside the living room, was a trail of blood. April gasped and started to panic when she realized the trail led to Bud and Melanie's first-floor bedroom. But she forced herself to slowly follow the blood and push open that bedroom door. And when she saw what was inside, she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. She staggered backwards away from the room, then ran to call 911. Within the hour, at least 6 police units and a team of crime technicians were at the Billings home, documenting the horrific scene and collecting evidence. Deputy Robert Guy climbed out of his cruiser in front of the house. So far, he'd been told that the homeowners, Bud and Melanie Billings, had been found shot to death inside of their bedroom. And before even stepping 1 foot inside of this house, Guy already had a theory. So, he had been with the Escambia County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and in his experience, when a couple was found dead at their home, it was always a murder-suicide. But even if that was what happened here, Guy had never worked a case like this before, because he'd also been told that 9 young children lived inside of this home, and they were actually in the house during this shooting. They had all been found hiding around the house during the initial police sweep, and they were now standing outside by a police cruiser wrapped up in blankets. There was an adult woman standing with them, and Guy could see that all of them, the woman included, were either sobbing or staring off into space, clearly in shock. Guy felt this wave of sympathy come over him. These kids were too young to go through something like this, and so the more time he could give them to process, the better all. So, instead of speaking to them first and forcing them to sort of confront what had just happened, he decided his first move would just be to go into the crime scene and have a look around. Guy headed towards the house and entered through the front door, and the first thing he noticed was there was a big boot print on the wood of the door, and the sides of the door were all splintered. This door clearly had been kicked open, and so seeing that told Guy that his murder-suicide theory likely couldn't be true. Someone else had forced their way into this home and committed this crime. Guy asked the tech to take a photo of the door, then he went inside to do an initial walkthrough of the first floor. There was some blood in the front hallway, and even more of it soaked into the living room carpet, where there was also a bullet hole in the floor. So at least part of this attack must have happened here. Guy then headed to the primary bedroom where he'd been told the bodies were, and the first thing he noticed in there was that there was a lot of blood soaking into the carpet, and there were also a bunch of shell casings on the ground. Bud's body lay at the foot of the bed face down, and when Guy approached, he could see that Bud had been shot multiple times, including at least once in the head. And he also had a zip tie on his left wrist. And so clearly at some point the killer must have tried to restrain him. Melanie was by the closet on her back, and also she had gunshot wounds in her head and chest, and she did not have any restraints on. And so she had either cooperated with the killer or was just shot first. After looking at Melanie, Guy's eyes moved over to the closet right nearby, and it was wide open. And he saw inside the closet there was a very clear square impression in the carpet on the floor. It looked like something very big and heavy had been removed from that spot, possibly by the killer. And so, this gave Guy a new theory. If something had been stolen from this room, that suggested this was a robbery. And maybe Melanie and Bud had just gotten in the way. So Guy left the bedroom to do a full walkthrough of the whole house, including the upstairs, with this theory in mind. However, he didn't actually see anything else that pointed to a looting or a robbery. Big-ticket electronics and jewelry were still in the house, and so was a safe that was upstairs. which of course could mean his new theory that this was a robbery was wrong. Or it could mean this was a robbery, but the robber had only been looking for something specific that they knew was in this house, like, for example, whatever that heavy square object was that had been at some point sitting in the closet in the bedroom that left that impression in the carpet. He really wanted to know what had been in there, so he figured now was the time to go outside and actually speak to the kids. Moments later, Guy was standing with the Billings kids and the woman who was standing with them. The woman said her name was April and that she was the one who called 911. As April spoke to Guy, she kept glancing over her shoulder at the kids to make sure they were okay, and Guy did too, because even though he wanted to speak to these kids, he knew he had to tread very carefully. Not only were these kids likely very traumatized, but anytime law enforcement interviewed young kids, it had to be done with precautions like with a specialist or trusted adult. So for right now, he was just starting with April. Her voice shook as she explained how one of the Billings' daughters had come to hurt Rayler and then also what she had actually seen when she went inside there. April said she lived on the property, but she hadn't seen or heard anything strange before going over there. April also told Guy that she looked after the Billings kids a lot and that they actually had other older kids, Ashley and Justin, who did not live in the house with them. And so she gave Guy their numbers and said somebody was going to have to call them and let them know what happened. Guy immediately headed over to some officers and asked one of them to get in touch with Ashley and Justin. Not only just to notify them, because that was obviously necessary, but also because these two likely could have critical information about this case. And in a domestic murder like this one, loved ones were always the first people Guy looked at as potential suspect. Just then, Guy turned and saw a flash of headlights coming down the driveway, and soon a car pulled up and a young couple jumped out. The woman was frantic and headed right for the kids. When some officers tried to stop her, she shouted that her name was Ashley and those were her siblings. Guy rushed over and she said again to him who she was, and also that the man she was with was her husband, whose name was Blue was her husband. Then she breathlessly explained why she was there. She called the home earlier and the kids answered, screaming that Mom and Dad were shot. She had been the one who told them to go to April's. She had also called her brother Justin, who was on his way too. But she said she still didn't know, were her parents okay? Had they really been shot? As gently as he could, Guy told her what happened, and he watched as Ashley collapsed in Blue's arms. A few minutes later, after Ashley had hugged the kids and calmed down enough to speak, Guy pulled her aside to ask her a few questions. She was still having a hard time catching her breath by this point, but she managed to explain their family situation. Melanie was her mom and Bud was Justin's dad, and the other kids were their adopted siblings who were adopted by Melanie and Bud. And so Guy let Ashley talk about her parents and her siblings for a few minutes. And then at some point he asked her the question that had been bothering him: did Melanie or Bud keep anything valuable in their bedroom closet? Ashley looked confused and then said, her parents had a safe in there, but inside of it was just documents and some sentimental pieces of jewelry. Nothing financially valuable. She said they did have another safe that was upstairs, and that one had a lot of cash in it, maybe around like $200,000. Guy hurried to write this down, and as he did, it just didn't make any sense to him that this killer potentially had taken a safe from the first floor that had nothing valuable inside of it, but then left the safe upstairs that potentially was full of money. But Guy wasn't really confused. It was more like he was excited, cause now he was thinking the killer must have inadvertently taken the wrong safe. And so, if this was true, it meant that whoever did this knew enough about this family to know that Bud and Melanie did have a safe, but the killer apparently didn't know enough to know that there were actually two safes in the house, one with money and one without. So, very likely this meant the killer was, somewhat close to the family but not that close, which made it unlikely that Ashley and her husband Blue, Ashley's brother Justin, and even April the neighbor were suspects. However, before Guy was going to eliminate anyone, he really needed to speak to the kids. So he asked Ashley if she would help him do that. About a half an hour later, Guy watched as Ashley and Blue coordinated with April to bring the kids away from the scene over to Ashley and Blue's place. By this point, neighbors had gathered outside, and everybody was just standing there watching the scene in total shock. It had proven to be very difficult speaking to the kids because they were kids and they were terrified, and many of them had disabilities, which also made it difficult for them to speak. However, during his conversation with the kids, Guy had been able to learn one huge thing. One of the girls happened to look out the window right before the murders and saw a red car parked outside. Now, she wasn't able to give Guy much of a description of this car, other than the color in that it was a bigger car, like an SUV, but a large red car was distinct. And Guy had already asked some officers to put out a message to patrols to keep an eye out for it. He also had officers speaking to the neighbors, but Billings lived on a pretty remote patch of land, so he doubted anybody had seen or heard anything because they just lived too far away. And so, Guy had just decided to wrap things up for the night when he saw another set of headlights appear from down the driveway. Seconds later, a car pulled up and a young man got out, and then he hurried toward the house. An officer stopped him, and Guy could see that at that point, the man began to look around and jogged over to Ashley and the kids. Ashley gave this young man a big hug, and then she began to cry into his shoulder. Guy guessed this young man had to be Justin, Bud's older son who Ashley had said would be coming. But even though he was only a few feet away, Guy thought there was just something off about him. He didn't appear to be shocked or even really upset at all. You know, he's just arrived at a crime scene where his parents had been shot to death and he seemed sort of unfazed. But actually, less than being unfazed, it was more like he was sort of nervous. He kept furtively looking over at the police and then the home, and sort of fidgeting a little bit. Now, like Ashley, Justin was very likely quite familiar with this house and also the location of the safes and what was in them, and certainly might not have needed to for sentry if he was going to come in here and rob the place. But Guy just had a feeling that something was up, and so he went to speak to him. And as he took the few steps over to Justin, Guy saw Ashley suddenly push herself away from Justin with what appeared to be a very urgent look on her face. When Guy reached the group, Ashley was just shaking her head almost incredulously, saying out loud that she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of that. Then Justin turned to Guy and said, "Has anybody checked the cameras?" Guy froze and asked what he was talking about. Justin told him that their father had cameras in basically every room, and he knew where the recordings were kept. Guy couldn't believe that nobody had noticed these cameras all around the property this whole time. But regardless, if they were as extensive as just unclaimed they were, this was huge. And also offering up this information suddenly made Justin's behavior seem a whole lot less suspicious. If Justin was on those cameras, he certainly wouldn't have mentioned them. But Guy still wanted to interview him at some point in a more controlled environment to get a better read on things. So before he ran off to tell the crime techs about these cameras and the tapes, he asked Justin if he would come to the station tomorrow, and Justin agreed. Around 8:00 p.m. the following day, Guy was sitting in his office staring at his desk phone, and he was feeling really antsy because his case had taken a huge turn in the last few hours. And now he was waiting on a call that he hoped would be the first step in wrapping this thing up. He still didn't have the surveillance footage, which would take a while. There were 16 cameras located on the property, and crime techs were still going through all the tapes. They also hadn't found any fingerprints at the crime scene either. However, they had used the bullets and the shell casings from the scene to figure out that the murder weapon, the gun that was used to kill Melanie and Bud, was a 9mm. It was information Guy could later use to connect the suspects. Guy had interviewed Justin earlier that day, and even though the 20-year-old had still acted way too casual for someone whose parents had just been violently murdered, Guy didn't think he was actually a solid suspect. For one, there was no motive. Even though Justin admitted that he and his dad were not on great terms at this point, he didn't seem angry with his dad. He also had an alibi. He was at his friend Greg's house for dinner that night, and Guy had confirmed it. And Justin knew about the two safes in which one was more valuable, just like Ashley had. But what Justin had given Guy was a suspect, a man named Cab Dicey. Cab used to be Bud's partner, but then he apparently stole from Bud's business. And Justin said he had actually seen his dad and Cab arguing over this money and how Cab still had not paid Bud back. And so if Bud had any enemies, Cab was very likely one of them. It had taken all day, but Guy had finally tracked down Cab at his used car lot in a town that was located about 20 miles away from the crime scene. And since this lot was actually in a different county, Guy had to ask some deputies from that precinct to go over there and see if Cab was actually there. And so now Guy was just waiting for their call, and a few minutes later he finally got it. One of the deputies rang him up and said they were at Cab's, and Guy would never believe what they found him doing in the back of the parking lot. He was cleaning out a red SUV. Within the hour, the deputies brought Cab to the station. Now, they couldn't bring the red SUV in or even search it because Cab had not given permission. So, Guy would have to see what he could learn from Cab himself. And as soon as Guy sat down across the table from Cab, he instantly knew, Cab Dicey was the kind of guy who always had an answer for everything. Like the red car, Cab said he was cleaning it because he was going to sell it tomorrow, which sounded way too convenient, but Guy let it slide. Instead, he asked about Cab's relationship with Bud, and to Guy's surprise, Cab launched into it irate. He said he hated Bud. Everybody did, because Bud Nickel hadn't dimmed everybody he did business with even though he was rich. And it was common knowledge he literally carried around a briefcase full of money, like 20 grand, whenever he was doing business deals. And so Cab told Guy about all these people Bud had screwed over, like him and his friend Patrick, who had been relying on Bud to invest in that karate company before Bud apparently pulled out over profitability. And then at some point Cab said if he was being honest, Bud probably deserved to get murdered. Guy couldn't believe what he was hearing. I mean, Cab had just admitted to despising a murder victim. And also he admitted to knowing that the same murder victim kept cash in his house. So, the next thing he asked Cab for was an alibi, but Cab had an answer for that too all. He said he was over at this other used car lot meeting about a potential business deal, and he said that lot was about an hour and a half away from the Billings home. And he gave Guy the number for the people he had been with when he was over there so Guy could call and confirm it. And Guy just got up and left the room to do just that. And like Cab said, his business partners confirmed he really was there during the time Melanie and Bud were killed. And so when Guy hung up the phone, he was frustrated. He had felt sure that Cab had to be involved, but there just was not enough evidence to keep him here. So Guy headed back towards the interrogation room to tell Cab he could go home. But before he got there, he noticed one of his detectives running down the hallway towards him. And when he got to Guy, the detective told him that after looking through hours and hours of footage from the Billings' house, they had found something that Guy needed to see. Late on July 10th, over 24 hours after Bud and Melanie Billings were murdered, Guy and another detective sat in front of a TV in silence watching footage from the Billings' home surveillance system. The shot they were looking at was from an outdoor camera, and it showed a red vehicle pulling up to the home around 7:00 p.m. Now, the license plates were covered, but Guy could tell this vehicle was not the same one Cab Dicey was caught cleaning. The vehicles were both red, but this in the video was a passenger van, not an SUV like the one Cab had had. And so this, along with Cab's alibi, meant they had virtually no evidence that Cab was the killer. But Guy quickly forgot about Cab because what he saw next on this video shocked him. 5 people wearing all black, gloves, masks, and carrying guns jumped out of the red van. They immediately split up and, without hesitation, ran to different points outside of the home. And then the footage inside the house showed these intruders entering from 3 places: a bedroom slider door and a back utility door, both of which must have been unlocked because none of those were forced open. And then, of course, the front door, which was kicked in. They all stormed into the living room where Bud was watching TV and where Melanie soon appeared. There was no sound, but Guy could see them talk to Bud before one of them shot the floor. After that, some of them zip-tied Bud's wrists, and then the one who fired at the floor then shot Bud in each of his legs. And then, after that, they dragged the couple down the hallway to what Guy assumed was the bedroom, where they disappeared. And unfortunately, there were not any cameras in the bedroom. Shortly after that, Guy saw on some outdoor footage the 5 intruders repairing, leaving the house now with a safe, and then they drove away in the van. The whole thing happened in less than 10 minutes, and they were only in the home for maybe 4 minutes. After watching this footage, Guy just leaned back in his chair, feeling completely stunned. All along, he had been thinking this was a robbery gone wrong, but what he had just watched seemed more like a military raid. It involved what appeared to be a sort of ruthless precision that seemed out of proportion for this small-town family home. But now Guy knew he must be missing something crucial about the Billings' family. It could be that maybe Bud was involved in some kind of criminal enterprise, and the extreme security at his home was to protect the family from his various shady associates. If that was the case, it was more likely this was some kind of hired hit done by professionals, and the safe was just stolen to cover up what really happened. And if that was true, it changed Guy's entire case and basically made all of his suspects viable again. You know, Cab's alibi was now worthless. The fact that he was not physically at the crime scene didn't matter because maybe he hired a hitman. Similarly, just because Justin and Ashley knew which safe had money didn't matter either because, again, they could have hired a hitman to do this. But now, in order to narrow it down, Guy, of course, needed to find the killers, the supposed hitmen. And since he now had an actual image of the killer's red van, he decided he would release it to the public in case anybody in the area had seen it. The next morning, Guy was at his desk drinking some coffee. He just released the image of the red van to the public, and now he was just waiting for local tips to come in. In the meantime, he'd also been looking into other areas of Bud and Melanie's life to see if there was anything that explained the apparent trained team of assassins that stormed their home. And he found out that Bud used to work in the strip club scene and he was known as a local investor for businesses in the area. But Guy didn't see how any of that connected to the murders yet. And all of his initial suspects, who he just put back on the table, were off of it again. He'd learned that Cap Dicey was basically homeless and living at the used car lots that he worked at, which certainly gave him a motive for robbing and killing Bud, but no means, because if Cab was broke, it was unlikely he could have afforded one hitman, let alone 5 well-trained hitmen. And then, as for Ashley and Justin, even if, that safe had been stolen as a decoy, to show that it couldn't have been them because they knew where the money was, well, there was still no clear motivation for either of them wanting their parents dead. Guy knew that Ashley had taken over operations for Bud's business and so, perhaps she wanted the whole business to herself. But with her parents' death, it meant that she sort of by default would become in charge of her 9 siblings, which was going to be a lot of work and stress. And so Guy wasn't really sure that trade-off made any sense. As for Justin, he just didn't seem like he had enough anger to want Bud or Melanie dead. Plus, he was the one that literally pointed out to Guy that there were cameras all over the house, and so it was doubtful he would send hitmen to a home he knew was littered with surveillance cameras, only to tip the police off to go look at the camera footage. But just then, an officer poked his head into Guy's office and told him that a woman had just called the tip line and she believed she had actually seen that red van in her neighbor's backyard. An hour later, Guy, along with another detective, stood in the backyard of a home in Pensacola, Florida, located about 15 miles away from the Billings' home. This house belonged to the neighbors of that woman who had called their tip line. Basically, they were at the house where presumably this raid van was located. A couple lived at this house together, but right now only a woman was home, and she gave the detectives permission to go look around the property. And sure enough, in the back, the detectives found a red passenger van parked behind a shed. The van was missing its license plate, and also there were all these patches of black spray paint all over it, like somebody had been trying to alter its appearance. At some point, the other detective wandered away from the van and began walking around. And then a minute later, he yelled to Guy to come over and look at something. And so Guy jogged over and he saw there was this burned-out fire pit right in the backyard. And when Guy looked inside of it, his jaw dropped. At the bottom, in the ashes, was a pile of partially burned black clothes, just like the kind of outfits that the killers were wearing in the footage. Guy turned to look at the home they were standing behind. At this point, Guy knew they had to get that van out and they had to bring the couple who owned this place in for questioning, because that couple either knew who killed the Billings or they had done it themselves. It would be a few hours before Guy finally spoke to the husband of the woman who had let them into the backyard, and when he did, That man told him everything. Based on multiple confessions and surveillance footage, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bud and Melanie Billings on the evening of July 9th, 2009. Around 7:00 p.m., the killer stormed into the Billings' home. As they did, they could hear their four other hired accomplices running through the house as well from where they had entered, and the killer knew they would all congregate in the living room as planned. They had all practiced for this moment for a month, so everybody knew exactly what to do and what their role was. They were ready, and their execution would be flawless. So the killer ran into the living room, and by the time they got there, their other accomplices had arrived there too. And so the team of 5 swarmed Bud, who had been watching TV, and they also grabbed Melanie as she ran into the room screaming. The killer then struck Bud and demanded to know where he kept his money. But Bud said he didn't have any, which the killer knew was a lie because it was practically common knowledge that Bud kept a lot of money in his home. That was why Bud had so much security and lived in the middle of nowhere to protect his money. And so, the killer was not going to let Bud lie his way out of this. And so they pulled out their gun and fired a warning shot right into the floor. That way Bud and Melanie knew they were serious. Bud flinched, but when the killer asked the same question about the money, Bud still said he didn't have any, and that's when the killer became enraged. They coldly ordered their accomplices to tie Bud up, and then, once he was, the killer walked over and shot Bud in the leg. And even though Bud began screaming and so did Melanie, the killer, calm as can be, just asked their question again, "Where's the money?" But amazingly again, Bud gave the same reply. And so the killer aimed his gun at Bud's other leg and shot that one too. At this point, Bud and Melanie are screaming at the top of their lungs, and the killer and their accomplices just grab Bud and Melanie and begin dragging them down the hallway towards the bedroom. And when they got into the bedroom, the killer smiled because the closet door in the bedroom was open and they could clearly see there was a safe sitting inside. And so the killer told their accomplices to go get some duffel bags ready. They were about to get their cash. And so once the accomplices were gone to get their bags, the killer was alone with Bud and Melanie. And they turned to Bud, who by this point was writhing in pain but quiet, and they asked Bud to open the safe. But through gritted teeth, Bud claimed there was no money inside of it, which made the killer even more furious. How could Bud still keep lying? And so the killer, without even thinking, put their gun right up against Bud's face and shot him through the cheek. Bud fell to the ground, shocked by the blow, but still very much alive. But the killer walked over, they aimed their gun at Bud and fired several more times. Melanie began screaming right behind them, and so the killer turned and demanded that she open the safe. And when she didn't either, the killer shot her multiple times as well. When the killer's accomplices returned, they knew they were going to be shocked to see Bud and Melanie dead. This was not part of the plan, and the killer was anxious too. They really had not expected this to happen, but the killer thought, "You know what? It doesn't matter. We don't need Bud and Melanie. They could just take the safe and break it open later." So together, the accomplices and the killer hauled the heavy safe out of the home and into the waiting van. 10 minutes after they'd arrived, the killer and their accomplices drove back down the Billings' long driveway, eventually returning to their father's home, where they parked the van out back and burned all the clothes that they had worn during the attack. Finally, after all that, the killer went home. And as they were driving, they thought about the safe that they had stolen and how relieved they were that, finally, they had some money for their business. It would turn out the person who organized the robbery and eventual murder of Bud and Melanie was one of Bud's former business associates, Patrick Gonzalez. Patrick owned a karate company, and at one point, he had tried to get Bud to be an investor, and initially Bud seemed interested. And for a moment, Patrick felt like all his financial problems were about to go away because here comes Bud with all his cash. But then Bud backed out, citing, lack of profitability. And after that, the karate business failed, and so suddenly Patrick was desperate for cash and simultaneously feeling very burned by Bud. And like everyone who did business with Bud, they assumed that Bud was very rich. Patrick knew Bud had a huge house, and also he had this state-of-the-art security system, sort of reinforcing the idea, behind the walls of this home there is great wealth, In reality, the reason Bud had a big house and had the security system was just for his kids. He'd worked hard to build them this big safe house. But to Patrick, he was convinced Bud had potentially millions of dollars stored in that home, and he was gonna get it. So before the murders, Patrick asked his father, Leonard Gonzalez, and a group of men he knew from working at a mechanic shop to help him rob the Billings. And under Patrick's guidance, using his self-defense knowledge, the group trained for a month to pull off what they thought would be a very smooth, efficient heist. Killing the Billings was never a part of the plan. It was just about taking the money that Patrick had convinced them all was going to be in this house. However, Patrick had become enraged once he had confronted Bud and felt like Bud was lying to him and further, insulting him. And so he had killed the couple. And so after Guy and his team found the van at Patrick's father's house, police brought the father Leonard in for questioning. And very quickly he turned his son in. Patrick Gonzalez was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. As for his father, Leonard Gonzalez, he received a 17.5-year sentences, and the other accomplices involved in the attack got between 22 years and life. While this is just speculation, it's believed that the reason Bud and Melanie did not give up the code to that safe is because they knew in doing that, the killer and the accomplices would see there really was no cash in there, and they wouldn't stop until they searched the whole house and found their cash. And they knew that their cash was actually located upstairs in the second safe where their children were. And so very likely Bud and Melanie essentially died, ensuring that these intruders never went upstairs and so did not harm their kids. As for the 9 kids, they were raised by Ashley and her husband Blue, who eventually moved into the Billings' home. A quick note about our stories: they're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.